So as we start this third part, let's just quickly do a review. This first Punic War that begins in 264 BC and results in Carthage losing Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. And I just want to go into a little bit of detail on that. Of course, this was mostly a naval war. It was fought with really dealing with colonies over on Sicily, and the Roman ships and the Carthaginian ships were, these big galleys that were rowed by sometimes dozens of rowers. So they had a lot of oars that stick out the side. You've probably seen some of these big galleys, these big long ships that the Romans used. Now the Greeks kind of started this, and they had what was known as a trireme, and of course it had the sail. We're looking at a side shot of the trireme, and it had 3 rows of oars up here on the side of the ship, and each of the oars, each of these oar ports had an oarlock, and so these oars are extending from the side, and they had a ram in the front. Usually the ram was below water, and so the ship would move forward. Well, the Romans and the Carthaginians, same thing. The warships were of this ramming type, and what they did is, of course, the Romans, very innovative. One of the things you see, Rome, very aggressive, but they knew that they were going to lose. They had a poor navy, and the Carthaginians really had centuries of practice and were very good sailors. So the Romans reasoned, let's fight this like a land battle. Let's get close enough. If this was a Roman ship here on the left and the Carthaginian ship here on the right, if the Roman ship could get close enough, let's fire over a grappling hook, grab the Carthaginian ship, and then pull it next to the Roman ship. And then once the 2 ships were side by side, the Romans had pulled the Carthaginian ship to their side, they would throw down these big ramps, and the ramps would fall down onto the Carthaginian ship, and the Roman soldiers would run across, and there would be a land battle, basically, an infantry battle on the ship. So in essence, the Romans were the first Marine Corps. Marines, of course, are Navy infantry. So the Romans used infantry, and they fought basically a land battle on a ship. So they utilized their strength. Their strength was the infantry, and they utilized this surprising tactic of a grappling hook. So let's not forget to talk about that, a grappling hook. And so the Romans won using that to their advantage. Okay, so a Marine is a seaborne infantryman. An army soldier is on land, an infantry on land. So anyway, as a result of this, Rome was able to control the Tyrrhenian Sea and the sea around Sicily, and defeated Carthage. Now the Second Punic War, of course, a little bit of a review there. Hannibal crosses an army from Africa into Spain. He goes over way to the west, crosses into Spain, then marches his army along the coast, goes over the Pyrenees, which is a big, big surprise to the Romans, and comes down and surprises them. So This was in 218 BC. Now, key battle that we want to look at before we look at Canaan is a battle called Lake Trasimene. Trasimene. And this was in 217 BC. And this is up in northern Italy. Lake Trasimene. Looks like Trasimene there. And so there's this big lake, and the shore of the lake extends here. There's water, of course, in the lake. And the Romans were marching their legions. There were 3 legions that they were marching, and in this direction. They were marching in a western direction near the shore of this lake. Now, they didn't know it, but up in these hills that bordered the lake, nearby hills, Hannibal had positioned the Carthaginians. And so the Carthaginian army was up hidden in these hills. And as the Romans, I'm going to put an R here for the Romans and a C for the Carthaginians. As the Romans marched by, and oh, by the way, this region between the hills and the coast was about a half a mile. So it's about a half a mile. And these 3 Roman legions are marching by, and then the Carthaginians sweep down on the Romans and pin them into the water. So this is a real bad situation. If you're a Roman and you've got the water to your backs, and the Carthaginians are coming down, they've been hidden. They have several of the key elements of a battle. They have the battle of surprise. They've won that. They've won the element of surprise. They also have the element of high ground. So they have on the higher ground. And then they've got a third element here. They've got the Roman army with their back to the water. So the water is a terrible thing to now have in your rear. So what happened is in this particular battle, this is toward Hannibal's beginning of his time in Italy, they destroyed 2 legions, about 12,000 men. And so this was kind of the way Hannibal would operate. He was very innovative. He seized, he had a great understanding of the terrain. He used the terrain to his advantage. So I'm going to make a couple points there because the terrain is a critical feature and a factor in the next battle, the Battle of Canaan. Let's take a look at this Battle of Canaan now. Now, I'm going to kind of do a scene 1, scene 2 battle. In Canaan, the Roman, they had, I think it was 13 legions. It's either 12 or 13 legions. And each legion at full strength is 6,000. So the Roman legions arrayed in a checkerboard pattern and in a show of huge strength when they entered when they got onto the battlefield near Canaan, they spread out and appeared as this checkerboard square pattern. So the legions were moving forward. I'm going to shade in the ones that are the Roman legions. Okay, so as we're looking at this Battle of Canaan now, let's zero in on this, on what the Romans have done and what Hannibal has done as well. So basically, there's a river that's on one side. It's running down the side of our map. On the other side are these hills, these mountains, hilly area. And of course, hills will break up, and a river will break up your formation. So if you are infantry formation, you can't really maneuver very well through hills and maintain your ranks. So the Romans chose to be on this flatter area. Well, Hannibal put his men out in kind of an arch, and it was kind of a thin line. The ranks of only about 5 or 6 of the soldiers, and then he put 6,000 men in groups on either side, kind of concealed by the line. The Romans did not see these two big groups of 6,000. And then you'll notice both the Romans had cavalry on their flank, on their end of their line, and the Carthaginians also had cavalry. And these were the famous Numidian Cavalry. Now, the Numidian Cavalry had Arabian horses, very fast, very tough horses that were from northern Africa, the Arabian breed. And so what you see is that the Romans, marching forward, had over a mile to march. And so their array from this area where they started to where the Carthaginians had lined up was about a mile. Now, they weren't running. It wasn't like marathon where the Greeks were running, screaming, and going downhill on a confused mass of Persians with ships right there on the water's edge. The Carthaginians were a little bit uphill, and they had arranged so that there was sun. Hannibal had chosen that the sun would be a little bit at their eyes. The wind was in this direction. The wind was coming down in the Romans, and dust that the Carthaginians would stomp up, and movement. Dust would also go into the Roman faces. And so the Romans had definite disadvantage here as they had to face the wind, they faced the dust, and had the sunlight, the early morning sunlight rose and got them in the face. So as they came up this and approached the Carthaginians, they pushed into, because of the great mass of their infantry, their legions, they push into the Carthaginians' front line. And that line just bowed. And so the line kind of bent backwards. So we're going to go now. This is scene 1. And we're now going to go to scene 2 as we further describe the battle. Okay, so now you can see scene 2. This is the battle scene now as the Romans have marched down the field, across the field for an hour or a mile, and it probably did take them close to an hour. When they hit the Carthaginian line, the Hannibal's army just fell back. They let the line bow back, which was part of the plan. The Romans, of course, their units get mixed together, and there's a mixing of the units as they come in and they come into combat, and they're headed in. And that's why the Romans had these big, tall standards that they put up, and they had the legion number on them, and so the men could see. That's why they have flags on the battlefield, so that soldiers can see their different units. And the Romans followed them in. They followed them into this bow. And then, surprisingly to the Romans, these 6,000 men, these two bodies of 6,000, rushed over and into the rear and into the flank. The flank is the end of the Roman line. And then the cavalry, the Numidian cavalry, surged ahead and pushed back the Roman cavalry, which was not as good. The Roman cavalry was kind of an inferior, much inferior to the Numidian. So they pushed them back, and then they also went behind and sealed off the back of the Roman line. So the very good Numidian cavalry was instrumental. They neutralized the Roman cavalry. These two units were neutralized. They didn't really have much to do in the battle. And after that, the Numidians just kind of joined into this clash in the rear. And so basically on both sides, both ends of the Roman army, there was an envelopment. They were totally surrounded. And so this is called a double envelopment. It's where you take both sides. Sometimes you can defeat the enemy by just doing this to one side, and then the enemy's whole side crumbles. But in this case, Hannibal did it on both sides. It's a double envelopment. So the Roman casualties were the worst they had ever suffered in history. This is their worst defeat. And they lost about 75,000 men in one day. Now, you might think, well, why didn't the Carthaginians follow through and try to get into Rome? If they just defeated 12 legions, why didn't they just get into Rome real quick while the Romans had their guard down? Well, they tried, and and they were not successful to do that. Let me talk a little bit about the Roman commander now. We've talked about how all the things that Hannibal did in setting up the battlefield and his skill. The Roman commander at this famous battle, Canaan, was a commander named Varro, and I think it was actually Varro, and he was a Roman consul. And so if you remember, the Romans had two consuls, and one would stay in Rome, the other would go out with the army. And he was very stupid. He was a risk taker. He should have known better than to take risks with the army against such a general as Hannibal. But he did not, he did not use his brain in this battle, and he was killed in action. So he was surrounded and killed in the battle. He was very impetuous. You can kind of see that one of the things he relied on, which didn't seem to have any effect on the Carthaginians, was the size of the Roman army. He spread the whole thing over the field and tried to kind of freak out the Carthaginians with the size of the army. And so every day, another problem that occurred was that each day the Romans would trade leadership of the army. So each day, a different consul was in command of the army. It just kind of like seesawed back and forth, back and forth. So that's a dangerous thing because, that gives an uncertain instability. The leadership in the army was unstable. So this greatest battle of ancient history should have probably resulted in Rome surrendering. But here's where the Roman character comes into play. The Romans didn't surrender. The Romans persisted. So even though they lost over half of their men, all of the men in this one battle, they pulled it together. They showed determination to resist Hannibal, and they showed the toughness that they became famous for. They're very tough-minded. Now, Hannibal was, countered, of course, several years later. To be precise, he was countered, and this was in 216. So, this was 14 years later. Scipio attacks, and Hannibal is recalled to Carthage, and at Zama, he has second-rate troops. He's got militia against these Roman troops. Hannibal did not have siege machines. Siege machines would have been necessary to take Rome right after this battle of Canaan. And so he didn't attack it for 15 years. So even though Hannibal was... So Hannibal's biggest lack was the lack of siege machines. He would have needed to have siege machines, and he didn't have any. Because he was kind of on the run, he's always moving. They could not devise the siege machines to push into Rome. And they had a lack of that. And that was the biggest reason that he couldn't get into Rome. But so maybe his, in a way, his great strength, being mobile, being able to move around, and not being tied to a base, but being able to maneuver freely, that advantage was also ended up being kind of a disadvantage, because he never got the siege machines that he needed to take Rome down. So the Romans win. Carthage was not destroyed totally. And so the result of the Second Punic War was, though Carthage was not destroyed, Rome gets the colonies, the Carthaginian colonies, in Spain. They pick up all of the Spanish colonies, the Balearic Islands, which are the islands just off the southern coast of Spain. So the Balearic Islands were also now Roman, and they even pick up parts of North Africa. So the big thing that they, and the reason they didn't destroy Carthage, was that the Romans wanted huge tribute payments, and these were huge. These were ginormous. These were huge tribute. Now, tribute's like a tax that you must pay, or you get attacked if you don't pay it. So, huge tributes. And it's kind of like a tax. It's not a tax. This is a defeated enemy. So they did not destroy Carthage completely, and so the Third Punic War begins. Now, what brought this about? You would think that Carthage would be so worn down, and that they would just stop in their conflict with Rome. But Carthage actually gets stronger over time. Even with these huge tribute payments, Carthage becomes stronger and stronger. Their fleet expands, and you have a Roman senator, Cato, who is the famous Roman, announces almost daily in the Senate, Carthage must be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. And his is like a mantra that he would not cease. And he believed they just had to, give up, and they had to take Carthage. So what the Senate did was they passed a law, and this law required Carthage to move 10 miles inland. Now, can you imagine requiring a city to move 10 miles, kind of pick up a city, move 10 miles away from the coast? So they required Carthage. I've never even heard of this, but this actually was the law. I'd never heard of it before, to move 10 miles inland. And of course, Carthage couldn't do that. That would be, can you imagine moving Albuquerque 10 miles? Let's move Albuquerque to the other side of the West Mesa. Let's just pick up the whole city and move it. Well, you can't do that. That's impossible, okay? So when they couldn't do that, this set off the Third Punic War. So when this impossible requirement was not done, that's what set off the war. Now, in the next tape, we'll take a look at the Third Punic War.